And how does this work with AI generated content and derivative content? Does that change things?
Yes and no. As you know, AI content is kind of new, and I always say that
Yeah.
technology develops faster than the law, right? So right now, what the Copyright Office has said is that you can file for copyright registration with content that had been generated with AI, but it has to have a significant human interaction or inclusiveness in this. So, for instance, you cannot just go on ChatGPT and create an ebook and file that ebook with the Copyright Office. You would have had to take.
Welcome to American Gypsy Podcast. I'm your host, Gypsy, and today I have a special guest, Karin Coger. She is an attorney and CEO of boutique intellectual property firm that helps content creators and entrepreneurs protect their brand and content. Welcome to the show, Karin.
Thank you for having me.
Glad to have you here. Now, I know I only scratched the surface of what you do, so if you can give us a background in how you got started and what you do.
Absolutely. My background goes way back to college where I was a mass media major. I majored in broadcast journalism, but loved all things media. With doing that, when I went to law school, like a lot of young aspiring attorneys, I was like, I'm going to go and be an entertainment attorney. You know, looks very famous and glamorous and all those type of things. However, it was very hard for me to break into that industry coming out of law school. So I actually got into litigation. So I was a defense attorney for approximately 18, 19 years. So I was definitely the attorney that you see on TV that's in court, that does depositions, but I still had this interest. And when I say media, I niched down into intellectual property law, focusing on trademarks and copyright. So once I got to a place where I was able to open my own firm, that's the area that I decided to work in, because I am entrepreneurial by spirit and therefore wanted to help other entrepreneurs.
Okay. And I know you focus a lot on intellectual property, and that's mainly what we'll be talking about today, which I know a little bit about, but not quite. So, for anyone listening, what do we mean by intellectual property law, and why is it important?
Sure. So to put it most simply, I say that trademarks protect your brand and your business, and copyrights protect your content. Okay, so to start with copyrights, as soon as you put anything into a fixed medium, such as this podcast or this recording would be considered a fixed medium. You do have a copyright, you do own that intellectual property. However, in order to truly protect your intellectual property, in some cases, you do need to take the next steps in registering it with either the US Copyright Office for copyrights or the US Patent and Trademark Office for trademarks. So, for instance, for podcast owners, and I actually just really started focusing on you guys because I started appearing on a lot of podcasts like this. You know, I noticed a lot of podcast owners start off as hobbyists and maybe aren't, looking at it as a business at first, and then it grows into a business. And so, what would you want to do to protect your podcast? You would want to protect the name of your podcast, and so you would want to file a trademark for that, or if you have any special slogans or sayings that are exclusive to your podcast and makes your podcast stand out, you would want to file a trademark for that. Now, when it comes to copywriting your podcast episodes, that's a little bit trickier, in that the copyright process is actually easier to do. But then the question is, do I need to copyright every single one of my podcast episodes? Do I only copyright some of my episodes or the episodes that blew up? And why are you going to trademark and copyright? You want to essentially stop people from Number one, stealing from you. So stealing your name, stealing your logo, stealing your content, and protecting your brand. So when you think of brands such as McDonald's and Nike and Apple, they all very much stand out to you and they have this presence. So protecting your intellectual property is protecting that presence, that brand. The trademark protects, like I said, the brand and the logo, and the copyrights the content.
When we're talking about content creators and social media influencers, is the copyright law or intellectual property laws different than the entertainment industry?
No, it's all the same. The process is still the same for both content creators and people in the entertainment industry. I would say, though, with content creators, one of the big differences in what we are dealing with now is with, let's think about traditional media. So let's say you go and you write a script for a movie and you're taking it out and you're shopping it around and you're showing it to people. So you're going to want to file the copyright for that to protect your script, to protect somebody just outright stealing your script. Content creators are making content like this. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
we could record this and you can have it up in, less than an hour. And you might not think that your content is going to necessarily take off or go viral, so you're not, thinking, oh, let me go, copyright, every episode of my podcast or my every, TikTok video. And again, it gets a little bit complicated because are you filing a copyright fee for every single TikTok video that you produce? The actual process of it, which is filing the applications with either the trademark office or the copyright office, is the same all across the board. I think the biggest question right now is, well, when to do it. So I don't know if you saw a couple of the current viral moments. So there was the lady that had the saying on TikTok about, being demure and, being mindful. And, that took off. And within less than a week, somebody else or a couple of other people besides her went and filed the trademark for it, thinking, and this happens in other countries, if I file first, I'll get to own, that trademark, right?
Mm.
I'll be able to make shirts for it and sell it on Etsy and, be able to sue other people and send takedown notices if they use that term. Well, they didn't use it first. So in the US, the US is a first use country as opposed to a first to file country. So even though that creator did not file her trademark for that first, she can still have a recourse when she does go ahead and file. And there are other things that she can do to potentially stop these other people that try to essentially steal her term out from underneath her. Does
Mm.
that help?
Yeah. And in those situations, what can if let's say a person did file a trademark and it was infringed upon, what actions can someone take to call the action?
Okay, so when you file your trademark, first of all, the trademark process right now is taking about 12 to 18 months, right? So if you do have a viral sensation, and let's say you do file first, right? You're like, oh my God, this took off. Let me go file, my trademark application. Um, and you see somebody else, using it, you can send your cease and desist orders, but at this time, you only have a trademark application. You do not have the actual registration yet. And it really depends on the quote unquote infringer if they are going to be scared away by this. So if you send them a cease and desist order or a cease and desist letter, either from you or from your attorney, they might be like, oh crap, I don't want to get in trouble. I'm going to stop using this. Or if they are selling on, the major e-commerce platforms, when you do file what's called a takedown notice, the first thing they're going to ask you is, are you the owner of this, of this trademark? Is it registered? It's probably not registered yet, if it's happening in this, this viral sensation moment, but at least you can show that you filed for trademark registration. Some of these other companies also use companies that monitor these services. So another viral sensation that happened recently was the Huck Talk girl. I don't know if you heard about her.
No, I haven't.
Uh, okay, so she was out and about, and sometimes people do these like people on the street type of interviews,
Mhm.
and they asked her, like something along the lines of, what can you do when you're dating somebody to make it memorable? And she's like, oh, you can hakta basically on his member. So this goes viral. It goes crazy. Everybody's using it. Everybody's making videos. Everybody's making t-shirts. So she finally did get with an attorney. She finally secured counsel, and they did enlist a service that monitors all of the social media. It was monitoring all the e-commerce platforms and was sending out mass notices to take down other people that used that term. So, but at that point, she had gotten counsel. I think at that point, she had filed for the trademark and was trying to prevent other people from using it and essentially making money off of something that she made go viral.
Mm. And how does this work with AI generated content and derivative content? Does that change things?
Yes and no. So, as you know, AI content is kind of new, and I always say that
Yeah.
technology develops faster than the law, right? So right now, what the Copyright Office has said is that you can file for copyright registration with content that had been generated with AI, but it has to have a significant human interaction or inclusiveness in this. So, for instance, you cannot just go on ChatGPT and create an ebook and file that ebook with the Copyright Office. You would have had to take that ebook and add it to it, something from yourself, something that you wrote yourself. So whether you're writing intros or you're adding stories, or you're adding pictures. Okay. When it comes to pictures, the question is, can you copyright a picture that was, used by Midjourney? Because essentially, Midjourney is using other people's, content or their other people's work, to be trained on. So when you get that picture from the Midjourney, are you now taking it and altering it and adding to it? So it's not just something that is, 100% AI generated. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
How would they even know? You said if ChatGPT, you gave the scenario of it writing a book for you, how would, is there a way to know that,
Yeah,
that you didn't add your own to it?
absolutely. So there are websites that look for whether something is AI generated. There are also plagiarism websites that you can run people's work through. To like the one I use is called Copy Space. It's very old,
Mm.
but you can upload, something. You can upload something and it will show on the internet like where this was taken from. So there are definitely they're called detection tools that people can use to determine whether your work was AI generated.
Okay. While we're on the topic of new technologies, has IP laws evolved to cover things like, blockchain, NFTs, um, what else is in that space? AI stuff. Does that change when it comes to those things, or is it different?
No, the principles are still the same, but I'm going to be very honest in that I do not work in the blockchain and NFT industries. My understanding from NFTs, they're typically like tokens or art that's created in all of these same elements that I just told you about in terms of registering your work and whether it's AI generated or whether you add it to it, that will all still apply if you wanted to go ahead and, file a trademark or copyright for your NFT.
Okay. And with either one of those copyright or trademark, is that something that you file once and it protects you forever, or is there a time limit on that?
So in general, no. So for trademarks, what you're going to do is when you file and you are awarded registration, within your years 5 and 6, you do have to file additional paperwork to show the trademark office that you are still using it and how you're using it. Then you have to file again in years 9 and 10. With the copyright office. But so for the copyright, once you are awarded copyright registration, the copyright lasts for the life of the author plus 70 years. And so after that time, the work would go into public domain. So what's happening now is let me do some math. Let's say you had an author and they filed a copyright around 1954 and that author passed away in that year. It's coming up on 70 years from that. So now information that was registered for copyright at that point is now coming into the public domain. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. And you mentioned a scenario earlier in that somebody didn't trademark or copyright in the US, but it was used internationally. Now, if you do file a trademark or copyright, does that protect you internationally, or is that something you have to do separately?
You have to do it separately.
Okay.
Yep. So US copyright or trademark protection does not equate automatic international copyright or trademark protection.
Okay. So using this podcast as an example, because I get a lot of podcasters that come on the show and that listen to the show. So what would you suggest, you know, am I trademarking the name of the podcast or copywriting? What would you suggest using this podcast as an example?
Okay, so the first thing that we would do is do a trademark search for your name. So we would go online to see if it's being used yet. Now, I do not know, how long have you had your podcast?
It's been about 3-4 years now.
Okay, and how deeply invested are you in the podcast? Meaning, are you all over social media? Do you have merch? Do you have all of those things?
I do have, I'm on all platforms, social medias, any podcast distribution platforms. And then there is a merchandise called Consistent Self-Improvement that I sell on Shopify with different t-shirts and things like that, cups.
Okay. So what I suggest is that when anybody starts their podcast or when anybody starts their business, they do the trademark search at the very beginning, even before you file your LLC or your C Corp or your S Corp with your state, just to make sure that it's available. In a case like yours, when you've already been functioning for 3 years, now that you have this information, it's not like all is lost. You still want to do the trademark search, right? If the trademark name is available for your podcast, then I would suggest that you file it as soon as possible so somebody else does not come across and use that same name. So one thing that people don't recognize is that when it comes to trademarks, there are 45 different classes. So for instance, let me see, like let's use, for example, if I had a company called Desks for All, and all I did was sell desks, but somebody else had that same name, Desks for All, but they had a different function and it was an entertainment company, they could both still exist using that same name because they would be in different classes. So the same things apply to podcasts. So you can do a trademark search, you look and see if your name is taken. If it's already been taken, you look and see what class they are in. If they are not in the class that would cover podcasting, then I would suggest filing the trademark application for it. Now, on the flip side, if you do go and do the search and discover that there is another podcast out there with the same exact name, that's when I would definitely say, I always say consult with counsel, but at that point, definitely consult with counsel because there are other things that you can do. It's not necessarily all is lost. So for instance, let's say that person had a podcast, but they haven't used the name in 5 years. They might be up for abandonment. Or let's say, you have a podcast and it has geographic significance. So you're only really covering, events that happen on the East Coast, and they have a podcast that covers sports down in Texas. There's something that you can do in terms of like reaching out to the other podcast owner and coming up with what's called a coexistence agreement, stating we can both coexist in this space. This is the way I'm going to use my podcast name, and this is the way you're going to use your podcast name, and we're not going to infringe upon each other. So that's why I say in the beginning, the podcast, not podcast, but the trademark search, because all this applies to all businesses, not just podcasts.
Mm.
But it's so important to do that in the beginning or as soon as you realize this is something that you should do. Now, again, when it comes to copyright, copyright registration for a podcast is essentially $65 per recording or per episode. That is a lot to pay depending on what type of podcast you're going to do. So for instance, if you have a limited series podcast, like sometimes there are podcasts out there like Serial or ones that might cover a specific incident, and you're only going to have 8 episodes, but you think it's going to blow up, you think it's going to be big, then yeah, I would say go ahead and copyright each episode of that. But if you're pushing out content every single week, it's not necessarily very unique.
Mm. Yeah,
Okay, because when you copyright, you're not copywriting your idea, you're copywriting like your actual content. So if you're scared somebody's going to come out and like steal this exact episode, the way we're sitting here, the way we're talking to each other, the way the words are coming out of our mouths, that you'll want to protect. So yeah, so it's a little bit different. And again, this is where I do say you definitely want to consult an attorney.
yeah. It's a little tricky with content creators because you initially, for one, you think you most likely start out as a hobbyist and you don't
Mhm.
think even a YouTuber, you don't think like, oh, this is a business that I should get an LLC for or trademark and things like that.
Mhm.
And also, I don't think the concern of copywriting each episode is probably not a big issue because when you're online, honestly, you kind of know that things are going to be taken and remixed and things like that. But yeah, I think trademarking is something that is good to do because you never
Yeah,
know.
absolutely. I would say protecting your brand as a
Yeah,
whole is a lot bigger and more important than protecting every single little piece of content that you put out because it's just not realistic.
yeah. Well, Corinne, this has been an amazing and informative episode. Thank you for your time and valuable insight. Is there something you want to leave the listeners with before we close it out?
Absolutely. So right now, because I have been appearing on podcasts such as this, I've actually put together a podcast package to help podcasters. So what I can do is I can get that information over to you to include in the show notes. So I do offer a 30-minute free consultation to help you guys work through all of the questions that you just have for me.
Okay. Yeah, that would be great. And for the listeners, I'll have Corinne's information in the description as well as ours. Thank you, Corinne, and thank you for listening. Peace.
Thank you for having me.